Amen. Morning, church.
Morning.
Amen. I'll try to be really fast. I'll try not to ramble on too much. If you don't mind, turn over to the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy. Let's see if I can find my place real quick. We'll be reading just a few verses over in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Got just 2 verses. I'm going to set my timer and my clock up so I don't go too far. I realize it. Deuteronomy chapter number 28, which is the first 2 verses. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee high above all nations of the earth. Verse 2. And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Now, I'm going to take a pause from reading real quick. And something I've been doing this week, something I did Monday, I ordered 2 books that I thought I'd be interested in reading. I started reading, I actually kind of liked. First one I ordered was Fox's Book of Martyrs. Second one was A Trail of Blood by J.M. Carroll. I started reading The Trail of Blood first, then I would get to Fox's Book of Martyrs. I ain't too far into The Trail of Blood. I started reading down only about 40-ish pages in, and I feel like I've already learned a lot just by reading a little bit there. And the last part I got to, I did some reading yesterday, the last part I got to, it was talking about the establishment of the Catholic Church and kind of how that came to be. And what happened back then, it was about, you can pretty much just say the year 300 AD, back when Constantine, Emperor Constantine, whenever he took over, you know, for the most part, the Romans were all still pagan. They believed in multiple gods. The Catholic Church ain't really came to be yet. But Constantine was looking, he was saying, you know, I don't want to just conquer bits and, you know, little bits and here and there of Europe. Constantine wanted to conquer the whole known world at that time. And so what Dr. Carroll said that he's studying, what he read was Constantine, he looked at the power of the church. And he looked at it saying, you know, there's something different about the church. Amen. There's something different about this Bible. It's got true power, unlike all these pagan gods. Well, he was looking at that, and he was, in his mindset, he thought, well, you know what? I'm going to use this power to try to conquer the world. That's what Constantine wanted to do. And so, I believe it was the year 313 AD, if I remember the dates right, he called for an alliance of all the, I say churches, you know, it was really only true followers of Christ at that point. That, you know, there wasn't Lutheran, Methodist, and, you know, like I say, he was just now establishing the Catholic Church. He brought a whole bunch of them together, and at this point about the doctrine of infant baptism and the idea that Christ's blood wasn't good enough, that you had to get saved, not saved multiple times, but, you know, they believed all you had to do was get baptized. All that mindset was just starting to creep into the church. And all these churches, not all of them came together. While a lot of these people came together, Constantine said, you know, I'm going to give you power. I'm going to give you temporal power. I'm going to give you kind of a governmental power. So help me spread the power. Help me spread the Roman Empire. What I'm getting at this is, and okay, well, I ain't too far. But what I'm trying to get into this is, I wonder, out of all those churches, you know, obviously the leaders said, you know what? This is going to be a good idea. I probably should have brought the book with me so I could be a bit more accurate in what I say. But I wonder how many of the members looked at this saying, I don't think this alliance is what God wants. I don't think God wants us to have this so much temporal power. God just wants us to govern ourselves. He just wants us to follow the Bible.
Right.
You see, Constantine, he took over as the head of the church. He was more the figurehead than Christ. And whenever you put a man before God, it's not going to end too well. It's not going to be right.
Amen.
Well, we started doing this, and I'm trying to get to my point. Well, I'd love to get to my point, but there's so much. I could probably just bring that book and start reading, and y'all get something. But I wonder how many of the followers, how many of those people said, this ain't right. We shouldn't do this. We should stay where we're at, and we should follow God. And in these verses 28, hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee above high on all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee, overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord. If all that church, those churches, we ought to be unified. Whenever major decisions come by in our community or in our church, or even small stuff, I believe we should be unified. If we're all close to God, we should hear him the exact same way. He ain't going to tell you to live one way. He might tell you to go do something else. But he ain't going to say, okay, you can live right, you can live right, you can do whatever you want. Right. God ain't going to be like that. He wants us all to be unified, have the same mindset going forward into whatever it is. Now, each individual church might be facing different things, might need to face it differently. But I wonder how many of these people actually came forward and said to, hey, the head of the church, we don't need to do this. God don't want us to do this. And that about that year, 313 AD, whenever Christians really started to get persecuted. That's what that whole book is about. It's about the persecution of the Christian faith. I believe God didn't want that. God didn't want us to turn into something completely different. You know, Catholics, they don't believe in the true blood of Christ. They don't believe that's good enough to save. They believe in confession to a man. Like I said, anytime you put a man beforehand, they ain't going to end too well. Right. So what I'm saying is, church, we got to be unified. If we're all close to God, we're going to hear the same thing. Right. We ain't going to be completely divided down the middle. Like I say, these big things, if it's small things, yeah, sure, we might have different thoughts and different opinions, but when it comes on how we should live our life, what should be preached, which King James, and I'm glad we got a pastor who will follow this book, but we still have to be close enough to God to see, hey, we're men, we're going to end up falling, we're going to end up doing wrong at some point, we're going to be tempted. We also have flesh in us, but we got to be close enough and unified to bring it up saying, hey, we're still part of this, you're a member of this church, y'all are members of this church, we got to follow God and not necessarily what we want. And I know that's kind of sporadic today. I hope that helps somebody. But hey, if we're all close to God, we'll hear the same thing. Amen. We're all going to be unified. We got to, especially in these last days. We can't be having civil war in the church. I'm glad we're not. I'm glad we're unified. I'm glad we still love the Lord. We got to be close enough to listen to what He wants. Amen. And not just seek power for ourselves. Amen. Any birthdays or anniversaries this past week? Hey, y'all maybe just missed the Sunday school.
Good morning. Good morning. If you have your Bibles, we'll be going back to Daniel chapter number 6. I went back on YouTube since last Sunday's Sunday school lesson went live. I didn't listen to it. I can't stand listening to myself talk. I think it's just weird. But I did go back because I wanted to see how long I actually taught. Dad told me, he said, you went way past. I said, Dad, I didn't even start till like 20 after. We were late. And I went back and looked at it. And apparently I looked at my watch late. But anyway, my watch was running 8 minutes behind last week, so I thought I was still good, and I ended up, it was after 11 o'clock before I even finished Daniel chapter 6. And so I recalibrated my watch, and I made sure that it is on time this morning. So I try to do my best to be done by 10:45 in case we have visitors and stuff that come in. I don't want them just having to sit out there. And so, I do try my best to be done early in respect of that, other Sunday school classes getting done. But I only had one page of notes last week, and I taught for 50 minutes based off of what YouTube said. But I got 3 pages this week, so y'all in trouble. No, I just get caught up in studying the history part of it, and I studied a lot of the history of it again last night, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson before I even get into my Sunday school lesson about Daniel. Last week I kind of taught a little bit, or I mentioned a little bit about kind of the timeline of Daniel and how old he was, and what he saw during his life. If you study out how old he was when you read Daniel chapter number 6 and what's going on here, you find out that he's about 80 years old, and they've only been in Babylonian captivity now for about 60 years, if you study the history of it out. So, for the first 20 years of his life, he lived in Judah and got to witness, the going to the temple and doing the worship. Now, we know that they weren't doing what was right. If you read the book of Jeremiah, and he was prophesying against that crowd, but still, you read the life of Daniel and the testimony that he has just by other people that have been given it. Obviously here in chapter number 6, which we're going to deal with this morning, he was raised right and was raised around the things of God. And, his parents raised him up to know something about God, and you can see that in his life. So we know that he probably had some part to play, around the temple, and he watched all that get destroyed right in front of his eyes. But here in chapter number 6, I'm not going to recap all that for sake of time, but last week, we've been dealing with this thought of being found guilty of serving God. And last week we talked about Daniel and how he's found constantly praying here in Daniel chapter number 6. And this morning I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and deal with the next couple verses in the chapter. We dealt with the first couple verses there. I think it was all the way up through verse 10 about him constantly praying. And then this morning, if you read verses 11 through 17, I want to deal with the leader's petition towards Daniel and kind of the case that they brought and what they did to Daniel. And studying this out, I was looking at the beginning of chapter number 6, where it says it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first. And so I backed up in Daniel because I wanted to really understand how he got to where he was in in society. He didn't just all of a sudden just pop up and be the number one man to the king. Obviously God had a role to play in that, which he always does. But if you study it, if you back up to chapter number 4, you find a timeline of Daniel from the time Nebuchadnezzar is reigning in Babylon all the way through now to where Darius is kind of king over all of it. This is Sunday school, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a school lesson this morning. If you follow the timeline from chapter number 4 through chapter number 6, you find out it really captures most of Daniel's life in those 3 chapters. And you find out in chapter number 4, Nebuchadnezzar, he reigns and he's the king of Babylon from about 604 BC until about 561 BC. So he came on the scene right about the time, if you back up the timeline, he came on the scene right about the time that Daniel was actually born. So no doubt Nebuchadnezzar was probably the only man that Daniel had maybe heard about or knew about being king over Babylon. But he was king during the captivity of Judah. Obviously, if you study all that in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and you read Jeremiah, you find all that out. But if you study it out, Daniel, he was about around 40 to 45 years old when Nebuchadnezzar had the tree, or the vision of the tree. And, obviously the magicians and the soothsayers, he caught all them in and they couldn't interpret that vision. And so then they hear about Daniel, and he knows that the Spirit of God is on Daniel, and he calls Daniel in there, and Daniel interprets the vision, and we all know what happens. You can read chapter number 4 if you want to fully understand it, but he tells him that basically the tree is Nebuchadnezzar and how his kingdom is so great and it's going to be taken away from him. And then we know that Nebuchadnezzar, you find him in the field acting as a beast. And you can read all that in Daniel chapter number 4, verses 19 through 34. But then you see in chapter number 5, you see Belshazzar kind of come on the scene. And if you study it out, Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he is the next in line to be king in Babylon. And I was trying to line the timeline up to kind of find them in succession. But really, if you study it out, the only thing I could find is about around 556 BC is when he became king and ruler. And so while Nebuchadnezzar was ruler and Daniel was able to, I'm going somewhere with this, so just kind of bear with me. While Nebuchadnezzar was ruler and Daniel interpreted the vision of the tree, Nebuchadnezzar made Daniel master of all the magicians, the soothsayers, the astrologers, and the Chaldeans. You find that in Daniel chapter number 5, verse 11. It gives that account. So I'm trying to build up to how Daniel got to where he's at. So then you see Belshazzar come on the scene in chapter number 5, and he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel's now about 55 to 60 years old, kind of give or take a little bit. When he went in before Belshazzar and interpreted the writing on the wall. And you know that account given where he sees the hand of God writing on the wall. And so he knows, he calls for the magicians and the soothsayers and all that to come back in again. And they say, hey, there was this guy that was here back when your grandfather was king that interpreted his vision. He said, why don't you get this guy to come back in? And that's when you find out that Nebuchadnezzar had set Daniel up over. He was the master, the Bible says, of all the magicians and the astrologers. So anyway, Belshazzar brings Daniel in. Daniel interprets it to him. And then Belshazzar made Daniel the third ruler in the kingdom. So you can kind of see the ascension that Daniel's taken just because God is allowing Daniel to interpret these visions and these things that God's given these other people. And so then you find Darius here in chapter number 6. And Darius, just from the timeline of the book of Daniel, I didn't actually study history out. I did read a little bit, but I didn't read the timeline. There's a lot of people that say that Darius does not exist and there's no historical record of it. You can read all that and get all crossed up in the Bible if you just believe the Bible. That's all I'm going to say. If the Bible says it, they were saying that Daniel's a fictional character, it never existed. But, I believe what this Bible says. And if the Bible says there was a Darius that was king, then there was a Darius that was king, And the historians can say what they want. There was wars going on this time all around Babylon. Any document that may have had Darius in it may have got burned up. You never know what happened. But there is one document that still lives. And it says that there was a King Darius in Babylon. And if you find out, even though there's no historical records of it, if you just kind of follow the Bible, and I didn't study outside of Daniel to find Darius, but here in Daniel, you find that Darius, he reigns from, if Belshazzar was around 556 BC, and we know that he died, it said that he was slain, then you see Darius come on the scene. So Darius is the king from around 555 until around 534 BC, which is where the book of Daniel ends. And when Darius takes over the kingdom, obviously he had been told about Daniel and who Daniel was, and he knows the importance of Daniel. And he's like, well, this man knows some things. He's like, this man knows some things about God. He has God on him. So he takes Daniel, and we know from verse number 3, it says, then this Daniel was preferred above all the presidents and the princes because an excellent spirit was in him. And so Darius knew who this man was, and he said, you know what, I like this guy. I'm going to set him up directly under me. So that's how you get the ascension of Daniel and where he's at in society. And so if you go over here now that I've kind of, I guess, portrayed how Daniel got to where he was in leadership, you find all these men. So Darius is setting the kingdom up the way he wants it, right? And he sets up these 120 princes, and then he says, all right, over these 120 princes, I'm going to have these 3 presidents. And then the 3 presidents are going to kind of have rule over these 120 princes, and I'm just going to sit back as the king and let these men handle it. And when there's always trouble with people's hearts when you have a preference of somebody, and it's not Daniel's fault that that's what happened, but people get jealous. And can I say the same thing goes on every day, this day and hour? It doesn't matter who you are. If God blesses you, if you work hard and God blesses you with things, people will be jealous of you, and they'll run you through the mud as Christians if you try to do right and serve God. And nothing's really changed. And so there's just going to be those people, and it's sad that, you'd think that kind of stuff just happens outside the church, but it seems that stuff happens more inside the church than it does outside the church. And what a sad testimony it would be as a Christian to be known as somebody that always talks about somebody or is always running down other Christians. But that's exactly what these men had done here. In verses number 11 through 17, we find that these men, it says that they assembled and found Daniel praying. So we know that Daniel, he prayed constantly 3 times a day is what the Bible said. And these men knew about it. Maybe he had talked about it. Maybe he had witnessed to them. Maybe, maybe they had just been walking by. It said that he had went to his window being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem as in times past. If you read that, so maybe they had walked by and heard him praying. But anyway, these men knew that Daniel prayed, and not only did they know that he prayed, they knew where he prayed, they knew when he prayed, and they knew how many times he had prayed. So they've been following him and watching him for a long time. And can I say, as Christians, there's going to be people that follow you and watch you your whole life. And that's why it's so important as Christians that we maintain our character and our testimony, because you never know who's watching. I guarantee you Daniel may have not known how many people would watch him. He just done his duty as a servant of God and went on about his business. But anyway, these men, they have watched him, day in and day out, and knew when he prayed, how many times he prayed. and they assembled together to come against him. And they came against him because if you back up, they had a royal decree established that basically said if you ask any petition of God or of anybody in 30 days, except it come from the king, you're going to suffer the consequences of it. And that's just kind of paraphrasing it because I don't want to read all those verses again. But that's basically how it went. If you had a petition, you had to go to the king. There was no prayer. And they knew that because they could not find, and I don't want to get ahead of myself because I'm going to kind of back up in Daniel chapter number 6 and hit some of this other stuff. But they could not find any fault in Daniel. And so they knew the only way that they could get him is if they made a law up to against the only thing they knew that he did consistently. And so these leaders, these kings and these presidents, the first thing that they do before they make their petition is that I see that they assemble themselves together. And you can find the original assembly here in verses 4 through 7. It says, "Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom." It said, "But they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him." And so, they've been getting together as these rulers and talking. They know that Daniel is Darius's right-hand man. They know that he's the preferred man in the kingdom right under Darius. And I can see them getting together and they're talking, how did this outsider, because he was of the tribe of Judah, or he came out of Judah when they went into captivity. And so that he's an outsider in this kingdom in Babylon. He's not supposed to be there. It's like watching Joseph all over again, being an outsider as a ruler in the kingdom. And I actually have some verses to tie back to Joseph here, but it's kind of the same situation. His people got taken into captivity, and then he became a great leader in that society. And we know that Joseph, he was kind of sold into slavery, but God blessed and worked in that situation and made him kind of an outsider and a ruler in Egypt, and blessed him for it. And you can see that these princes and these presidents, they assemble together and they try to find fault and occasion against Daniel, but they could not. And you see that all of the people in the community that had leadership, some sort of leadership in the community, because it was more than just the presidents and the princes. You see them all kind of gather together down in verse number 7. It says, "All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute." So they had done more than just talks amongst their little groups. It wasn't just the 3 presidents. It wasn't just 120 princes. They sought to the fullest extent to get everybody involved that they knew that had some sort of power in the government to come against this one man. And so you see that the position they took was that they united the community, the leaders in the community, to come against Daniel. And can I say this? You better be careful who you allow to persuade you and who you hang around. It's so easy this day and time to get caught up in everything that's going on. And if you're not careful, you'll read that mess and follow that mess to a point where you'll allow it to start persuading you away from what you know is right. You can watch all these protests and everything that's going on, and I'm not going to get into all that because I will spend 2 hours up here. I'll just start preaching on all that mess, and it's not right what they're doing. I'm not saying that the initial cause behind it, I believe there's some justice there, but to the extent that they're taking it, it's not right, and it abolishes any type of momentum that they have in their movement because of what they're doing. And our country, the best way to put it is just pray for our country. It needs a lot of prayer. With the protesting, the governors that are the mess really started back in March when all these governors shut everything down, and it's just kind of built upon itself until finally people were fed up, and then this rioting came in, and it gave people an outlet to get out of their houses, most of them, being locked up, and people were taking advantage of it. The economy died pretty much, and a lot of people are struggling, and they're taking advantage of this looting and rioting and stealing stuff, and it's not right, and our country just needs a lot of prayer. But you better be careful who you hang around and who you allow to persuade you. A lot of these people that are doing this, and I was thinking about this when I wrote that down, a lot of these people are doing this have no idea. They're kids that have been persuaded and been manipulated by other people, and they're just following what that group of people that they've been hanging around is doing. So just be careful who you allow to persuade you and who you talk to and who you hang around. But thinking about what's going on here in Daniel chapter number 6 and how the people came against him, and they assembled themselves together. I mentioned Joseph earlier. If you go back to Genesis chapter number 37, verse 18, Joseph, he had the dream, and he's walking to his other brethren, and it said when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, the Bible says they conspired against him to slay him. And that's exactly what these men here in Daniel chapter number 6 are doing. They're conspiring against Daniel to basically slay him. That was their full intent behind what they want to do, because they put it in there that he'd be thrown into a den of lions. And, their intent was, this is an 80-year-old man. We throw him in a den of lions, he ain't going to have a chance. And they intended to move him out of their way. And, it's sad that people's hearts get to the point to where they're willing to do anything and run over anybody to get what they want. And that's exactly what these people done here. That's exactly what those brethren did back in Joseph's day. It's not necessarily that they wanted it, but they didn't want their younger brother to be ruling and reigning over them, even though that's what ended up happening anyway, because God allowed it to happen. And so, there's going to be people in this life that just try their best to set you up for failure. And, and they do it knowing what your values and your beliefs are. And it feels like, the Christians are getting so attacked this day and time. And I'm trying not to play victim because, it's a sad state to be in, but it's really the truth. They're attacking the church. They're attacking Christians. And I have to be really careful what I say here, because I'll go off on a tangent and go, there's a million different ways you can take this. But, it seems like this whole cry about racism, the ones that are crying are probably some of the most racist people that you've ever met, because the only thing they look through is a lens of skin color. And, they claim that all these people are oppressed and this, and I understand that probably happens in some places, but most of the places that's not the case. We're all subject to the same law. We're all subject, we all have to abide by the same laws, the same Constitution. What you do with your life is going to determine, how it turns out. And if you like I said a minute ago, if you hang around those kind of people, you're going to be depicted and characterized with those kind of people. And I'm not saying that all black people are bad, because that's not the case. I've got some black people that I work with that are good. And this whole inequality movement really frustrates me, because I watch black people that I work with that are good black people that make more money than I do. And they hold even more leadership positions than I do. And I'm not upset about that. They've worked hard and they've earned that. And I have no problem with that. But when you scream and cry about every white person is racist, then that makes you the racist. And I've really been frustrated a lot this week listening to all these people protest. And I'm not going to get off on all that, but it's really sad that that's what our country is back to, 200 years later. And I was watching pictures, I was flipping through pictures, and I seen the Lincoln Memorial where they spray painted it up, and it really made me mad. I about threw my phone, and I was like, these people, this is how dumb these people are. And I understand that, all Antifa ain't black, because that's really who's leading all these riots. But if they're claiming that it's a Black Lives Matter movement, and you're part of the Antifa group that defaced that memorial, you defaced the single man in this country that made the biggest impact on black people. And it makes no sense to me as to why you would deface that memorial, because he stands for more than just, white people. I was just, ignorance is what it is. And they're just doing it to do it. It's not a movement about black people. It's a movement about, I'm not going to listen to I'm not going to listen to law. I'm not going to abide by law. And that's exactly what it is. Anyway, back to my lesson. That was all free. They consulted together in verse number 7. You see that they're assembling, which is what I'm talking about. Verse number 7, you see that they consulted together to establish a royal statute. And they established it against the only thing that they knew that Daniel did on a continual basis. And so basically, they made a fake law for just 30 days. There was no reason to make this law. They just wanted to make it because they knew that they could get Daniel with it. And so they made a law against the only thing they knew Daniel did. And you know, and they've been talking about it, and I'm sure they've been meeting after, going out to dinner and talking about, going to other people's houses, how can we find this man to find fault in him, because we can't find any. This man's character is untouchable, and what a testimony to have as a Christian. That we would all have that testimony. When people come to find fault in us, this whole racism thing, let's just use that for an example. That when they look, they're like, I can't find a racist bone in Ross's body, or I can't find a racist bone in that person's body or this person's body. And, it's sad that people have taken other people's opinions and they're making them as facts. And that's what they did here in Daniel chapter number 6. They all got together and made an opinion. They're like, you know what? Well, we'll just make a law about it because this is what we believe. But I wrote this down. Don't be a Christian that assembles with other people to gossip and conspire against others. Don't be that kind of Christian that runs around other Christians, running your mouth about other Christians. If you didn't hear it from that person directly, it's none of your, first of all, if he confides in you, it's none of your business to run and tell somebody else anyway. Amen. And, the Bible talks about, being able to talk to one another and, dealing with it between yourselves. If they confide in you, keep it between yourself and that other person. Because we have so many Christians this day and time that are just looking for the next big thing to talk about. And I was watching Friends the other night. It was on TV, and it really kind of goes along with this. They were in an elevator, and Rachel, she couldn't get her boss to talk to her. But when she mentioned something about gossip, her boss slammed the stop button on the elevator, and she's like, tell me everything. And I feel like a lot of Christians are like that. It doesn't really matter what's going on or anything, but when you have something to say, it doesn't matter what's going on at that point. They stop everything they're doing just to listen, because it's the next thing that they can go tell somebody else about. I think it was Brother Goolsby that told the joke about the preachers in the boat, and they're all kind of confessing to one another what's going on, because they can only confide in other preachers. And they're confessing like their biggest pitfalls or whatever. And it comes around, I don't remember what the first two was, but it comes around to the third preacher, and he said, well, my biggest sin is gossip. He said, and I can't wait to get off this boat. And, it's sad that a lot of Christians, they have that mentality. They're just trying to be stumbling blocks. They're trying to be people that'll trip up other Christians. And none of us are perfect. You can find fault in every one of us if you wanted to. And, I've learned that I'm just going to worry about Ross and go about my own business. I wrote this down, thinking about the Antifa stuff. The people they're assembling for the Antifa and the riots and the looting and the protesting and even being patriotic. I've seen the Patriots assemble, and I was showing Dad a video the other day about Antifa and the Patriots kind of having a big old, it was about 300 or 400 on 300 or 400, and there was a big old fist fight. I don't know where it was at. I don't know if it was in Charlotte. It kind of looked like Charlotte, but it was in a city similar to that. And man, them dudes that were waving the American flags were just laying them Antifa people out right and left. And, it's not good that we have that going on in our country, but, you get so frustrated that sometimes you entertain that kind of stuff just because you're like, finally somebody's got some common sense telling these people what's right. But, thinking about assembling and all these people that are assembling together for all these causes, and these people here in Daniel that assembled together to come against Daniel, why is it that the church is continuing to be empty? Thinking about assembling, and everybody's assembling for all these causes, and yet you find the church being empty, and week in and week out, and even members that are faithful or used to be faithful, you find members leaving churches, and the church continues to be empty. If there's anything to assemble around this day and hour, it's the things of God. And I was reading a post by a buddy of mine that I went to college with, and I had no idea that he was a Christian. I knew he liked cars, and we talked about cars a lot, and I didn't ever see him much. I didn't hang around with him, but we're friends on Facebook, and the last couple months, he's been having a struggle with he just had a newborn daughter, and there was some issues when she was born, and all the guys talked about is prayer and how important prayer is, and and talking about that kind of stuff, and he was talking about everything that's going on and how important it is just to sit back and pray. He said the most important thing you can do during this time is pray. And somebody had the audacity to jump on that comment and say, if you're not taking action except for prayer, you're doing nothing. And, the blindness, our country's in a mess. It has forgotten the single most important aspect that we have as people, as Christians, is prayer. I taught on it last week, how important prayer is in our lives, and that secret prayer, that time, we spend alone, one-on-one with God. And, so many people in this country have no idea. We used to hear preachers preach on other people around the world never hearing the gospel. But I think we'd be shocked as Americans to know how many Americans have never heard the gospel, in our own country. We send missionaries around the world to all these other countries, and there's nothing wrong with that. But America is becoming more and more of a mission field every day. And I feel like a lot of missionaries, thankfully, thank God for Brother Daniel and his burden to go out there to Kansas, and I really hope that I haven't talked to you about it to see if anything had happened. I know with this whole COVID mess, they have been struggling to have people come into church. But, thank God for somebody that's got a heart for our own country as well. I know it's important that these other people hear God, but, our country, it's in a mess, and it needs God just as much as anybody else around the world. But thinking about, the assembly of the church, we all know Hebrews chapter number 10, verse 25. I think I read it a couple weeks ago. It says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, and that some now is much. There's so many people that don't come to church anymore. The manner of much is really, and that is the pandemic in America right now. It says, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching, not tear down one another. Don't say gossip. Don't try to find fault in other people. It says exhorting one another. And so much the more as you see the day approaching. And, our country, if we would turn back to that verse right there, if our country would get back in church, assemble itself back together under the things of God, it would solve all of our country's problems. We all know 2 Chronicles 7:14. I think me and Dad actually was talking about this yesterday. He said, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. It says, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And I wrote that verse down last night, and I think I might make a Sunday school lesson. I'm going to start working on it. I don't know when I'll teach it on the recipe, or the 4 things that'll fix your country. And it lists out the 4 things there, and then the 3 things that God will do on his part. But you see the assembling of themselves together. They came against Daniel to find fault, and they could not, so they decided to make a law about it. So you see the assembling there in verse number 11 says, these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplications. So after they assembled together, and you read prior verses and they get that law established, they go and find Daniel in verse number 11. It said they assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. But then in verses number 12 through 15, you see the accusations that they made. And you read back over there and you find that they could find no fault in him earlier when they sought to accuse him in verse number 4. The second half of the verse says, but they could not find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. And you could find, like I said, you could find fault in any of us if you wanted to. But that other verse, it says he was found faithful. And that's kind of what I was teaching on last week, the faithfulness of Daniel. He was faithful in his prayer life. He was faithful to have that relationship with God. He was faithful to the things of God. And that's why they could find no fault in him, because he was faithful to God. And so many Christians this day and time, our faithfulness has just fell by the wayside. We put faithfulness in everything else but the things of God. Have you ever met some people that seem like they just want to find something wrong with everybody? And I seem to find that more and more this day and hour, especially with what's going on with these movements and stuff. And it's almost like you can't say anything because you'll appease one side and not the other. But if you say the other thing, then you'll appease that side and not the other. And if you just kind of fall by the wayside, well, then you make both sides mad because you're not doing anything. And you can't win for losing. and what's really sad is that our leaders are lacking leadership during this time. That is a big mess in itself. We have leaders that are lacking in leadership. And I mean, look at our own state governor, for example. That dude, I can't wait till November comes around and vote that dude out of office. I'm so fed up with that dude and his hypocrisy and the double standard that he holds. You know, Dan Forrest, I've been watching videos of him going out around during this time, and he's been posting a lot of videos to Facebook saying what he would do if he was governor. And I'm like, I can't wait for that dude to get in. And Mark Robinson, that black guy that's running for lieutenant governor, I'm putting him in office right behind him. And, you know, I believe that our state, a lot of things can change in our state if we put those two men in office. You know, like I said, color doesn't matter, and shame on people that look at other people. I don't care if you're black or white. If you look at somebody else through the lens of color, you're just as racist as anybody else that you're claiming to be racist. And you know that man Mark Robinson, I love that dude. When I see him pop up on Facebook, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I stop what I'm doing because I want to hear what that man says. And he said something. He was out in Raleigh a couple weeks ago. I think it was before Dr. Ron Beatty and them went out there. He was actually out there around that time, but he was out there and he was talking to, he had that loudspeaker and he had turned it towards Governor Cooper's building, and he said, he was talking about how poor of a job he was doing as a governor, and he said, there's only one person that I serve. He said, that's Jesus Christ. Amen. And, you know, I hope that man gets put in office. You know, I feel like he's got the backing from the Republicans. I just don't know which way our state will swing because of how close everything votes. But, you know, I hope and pray that people are smart enough to vote Roy Cooper out. And you know, it'll move Dan Forrest up into that position, which will open up the lieutenant governor position and put Mark Robinson right in there behind him. But anyway, you know, people this day and time seek to find something that's wrong with you. And sometimes whether it's true or not. You know, here in Daniel, there was, you know, it was true what he was doing was praying, and they made that law just so that way they could find fault in him. But there was nothing wrong with Daniel. The Bible even says that they couldn't find no fault in him. And I was thinking somewhere where I read that it said that he was perfect. I can't remember where I read it, but anyway, people this day and time, you know, they're going to accuse you. It doesn't matter what you do anymore. It doesn't matter which way you stand, right or wrong. There's going to be somebody that'll stand up and accuse you for the way that you stand. But Exodus chapter number 20, verse 16, it says, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And it seems like this day and time, there's so many false witnesses going out and pointing fingers and yelling at people just so that way it gives them a reason to do what they want to do to fit their agenda. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. You keep hearing the fake news going around this day and time. And, you know, and the false narratives that are being made, you know, against people and you know, people are just they're making false witnesses against other people to fit their agenda. And at first you kind of seen it in the government, and now you've seen it trickling down to the people. And, you know, whatever the leadership that the government creates, the people will follow. And that's why I say that it's so important that we have the right leadership this day and time. But another pandemic that's going on in our day, and, you know, people this day and time create their own opinions and assumptions and treat those as facts. You know, you can't have a conversation with anybody anymore based on facts because they don't know the difference between a fact and an opinion. And you have a conversation with them, you're like, well, that's just your opinion. No, that's a fact. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. I mean, that's just the way that it is. You can't have a conversation with nobody because people are so apt to the way that they think, and if you disagree with them, then you're just not friend. You just can't be friends. Automatically you are the enemy of that person. And I've got people that I work with that we do not believe anything alike, but we're still friends. And can I say, if you cut people off because they don't believe the way that you believe, that is not the right way to approach it as a Christian. You know, they still have the same opportunity that you had to get saved, whether they believe your way or not. And for you to just walk around and cut people's ear off, which is basically what you're doing when you automatically disagree with others. Now, I'm not saying you got to go condone what they're doing, but that doesn't mean that you still can't be a friend to them. And, you know, that doesn't condone you as a Christian either to go out and do what they're doing. Even though, you know, some people as Christians, you know, they see you they see you not condemning somebody for doing something, they automatically start running their mouth, assuming that you're associated with that person, that you're doing what they're doing. And it's sad that we as Christians are so quick to jump and judge people like that. But there's a buddy of mine that I work with. I don't hang out with him a lot, but I do talk to him a lot, and he believes nothing like I believe. Matter of fact, he's probably one of the biggest Democrats that I know. But me and him are still friends. He talks to me, I talk to him. We can have a civil conversation anytime. And most people this day and time, that's something that's missing in our society. Can I say that's something missing in our churches? And that's why there's so much division and chaos among churches, because people, if you don't believe the way I believe, even though we all believe the same God and trying to serve the same God, if you don't believe or line up the same way I believe, well, then you're just not a Christian and you can't be saved. And there's so many Christians with that mentality, and that's the reason why we see so many churches falling apart and self-destructing, because people have no ability to be able to just live amongst one another. Like I said, none of us are perfect. You can find fault in every one of us, but to just push off somebody because they don't believe the exact same way you believe is not the right way to do it, and God doesn't like it. Matthew chapter number 7, verses 3 through 5 says, "And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." And so that we're so apt to jump on other people, but we never really look at our own selves. And I promise you, if we start worrying about our own selves more than we worry about other people, things will be running a whole lot smoother than what they are. Everybody runs around trying to accuse people and find fault in people when we never really take a look in the mirror and look at our own selves. Because I promise you, I spend more time keeping this guy up here in check than I do worrying about anybody else, because the biggest problem that I have is not you, and it's not those people out there that are protesting. The biggest problem I have is with myself, and we need to focus on ourselves. Real quick, last point, you see the actions that were made in verses 16 and 17. It says, "Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel." So you see the actions that were made. They threw him into the lion's den. And I'll just read this verse and I'll be done. But James chapter number 1, verse 14 says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and is enticed." And can I say, first they assembled and they talked amongst themselves, and then they made the accusation, but then they did the action. Anytime you meditate on something, I promise you it'll eventually become an action. And if you're doing something that doesn't line up with this Bible, anytime we go contrary to this Bible, or we go contrary really to the law, it's because we're drawn away of our own lust. And that's what's going on in our country right now with all these protests. Not necessarily all the protests, because some of them have been peaceful, but all the looting and the rioting, it's not because of the cause that they're saying it's because they've been drawn away of their own lust, and they see the opportunity to get the things that they've always wanted to have. And us as Christians, we ought to have a little bit more character about us than those things. And so I know that was kind of sporadic, but that's all